This is a summary of Joseph Butler's sermon number 9 entitled Upon Forgiveness of Injuries. And it begins with the same Bible verse that begins sermon 8, which is Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 and 44, which says, Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. So the purpose of this sermon is to explore what it means to love your enemies and to understand the role of forgiveness. And so he starts off this sermon with an examination of several negative emotions that God gives us in order to respond to the so-called irregularities and disorders in the world. He is interested in anger or resentment. In fact, he's talking about the same emotion. It's one emotion, he says, several different names, including anger, resentment, and indignation. He's talking about the same thing. He says that this emotion is in its proper place and rightly used, especially when we witness wrongs done to others, to strangers. We feel indignant about those wrongs, and that's proper and right. But when the wrong is done to me or you, there's a tendency for it to get out of hand and for it to be excessive or be abused. And the abuses he's thinking about are from the list of 5 abuses, if you recall, in sermon number 8. He's going to consider or focus on the 5th one, which is retaliation or revenge. And he's going to give a couple of reasons why retaliation and revenge are not lawful or morally permissible. He says, first, that retaliation will lead to more retaliation or more harm or more evil. He says it begets the cycle of evil begets evil and will lead to, quote, no bounds nor any ends. It actually, he says later in paragraph number 20, he'll say that if allowed to, it will lay waste to the world, so should be avoided. Secondly, this is paragraph number 6, we were given this emotion of resentment in order to respond to so-called irregularities and disorders in the world, not to create more irregularities and disorder. But if allowed to, then resentment will lead to revenge and retaliation, which will cause much pain and suffering and misery in the world. And so we need to avoid that. He says, but remember that the command is to love our enemies. We're supposed to love our enemies. How can we love our enemies if we are this angry or we hate them? And the answer to this in paragraph number 12 and 13 is that this is forgiveness. This is where forgiveness kicks in. So we're allowed to be angry, and angry is proper and right, but we're also supposed to love our enemies. And that's only possible if we check or keep anger below a certain threshold. And once it gets above that threshold and it leads into one of these abuses, then forgiveness is the act where we choose not to feel that way anymore, and we return now to a level of resentment in which we can continue to love our enemies. And by loving our enemies, he doesn't mean that we feel very sentimental about them. He just feels like it's the way that we would. Loving our enemies means loving them as a neighbor, as a stranger. The same way we would feel about a stranger, we should feel about our enemies as well. That's the goal. And that's because we have a duty to love and do good to others. So he considers as he's trying to help his readers to balance resentment and love, and so he gives them some advice at the end of the sermon in his concluding reflections, which starts in paragraph number 21. He says that most wrongs and resentment can be chalked up as misunderstandings. He calls them false mediums. He says that self-love is a type of false medium that colors the way we see the world and often leads to misunderstanding. So we might think that somebody wronged us when they didn't. We might think that somebody wronged us intentionally when it was unintentionally. And that's because self-love blinds us to the fact. Anger and hatred have the same effect. They are false mediums and will confuse us about the real nature of the world. And he says, quote, at the end of section 25, he says that the objects are not in themselves what they appear through that medium. So he wraps up the sermon in 27 and 28, saying that wrongdoers don't actually really deserve resentment as much as they deserve compassion, because they think that they've harmed others, but they've actually just harmed themselves more so. I mean, they have harmed others, but they've more so they've just harmed themselves. And the example he gives here is Jesus on the cross, who said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And then the last reason he gives that we should forgive others is that if we expect forgiveness on the judgment day, then it would look pretty bad if we've spent our lives in unforgiveness and not loving our enemies. So I hope that's helpful to understanding the sermon.